Right, that's a really great question, because you have the young people who can take charge of their own education, you have the parents who can search for alternatives, you have the entrepreneurial educators and parents who can build alternatives. But what about everybody else?
Welcome to the Revolution of One podcast, where the revolution will not only be televised, but also individualized.
This week's guest is Kerry McDonald. Kerry is a senior education fellow at FEE. She is the author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom, and a regular Forbes contributor on education. Kerry, thanks for joining me today.
It's great to be here, TK.
Kerry, we all know what school is, or at least we think we know. But the title of your book is Unschooled. What does it mean to be unschooled?
Right, so unschooling is really separating education from schooling. So it's looking at schooling as one method to be educated, certainly the most popular and widespread method, but there are so many other ways to be educated. When we think about human history, when we think about even prior to the 19th century, when there were robust apprenticeship programs, when you learned in your community, when you were immersed in the people, places, and things around you. And so unschooling really tries to reconnect with those other ways of being educated, of saying, yes, schooling is still one method, and it may work well for some people, but there are so many other ways to learn.
Now, is that the same as homeschooling?
So unschooling can be one version of homeschooling. There might be families who do home-based learning who decide to give their children a lot of freedom and autonomy and enable them to sort of self-direct based on their own interests. And that's a growing population. So roughly right now, the estimates are around 20% of the overall homeschool population in the US, which is around 2 million students, are using an unschooling approach or an informal approach to learning. But unschooling, what I talk about in the book, encompasses so much more than just a version of homeschooling. It also includes many of these alternatives to school that provide opportunities for kids to self-direct, to follow their own passions, and to find their own way without dealing with kind of a coercive curriculum.
All right, so we know what it's like to go to public school or private school or charter school. We know what it's like to stay at home and do the homeschooling curriculums.
Right.
Give us a vocabulary of some of what exists in that in-between space.
Right, so whether you're a homeschooling family sort of doing this as a version of homeschooling, or if you're sending your kid to a self-directed learning center or an unschooling kind of school like the Sudbury model, or any of these other alternatives to school that are sprouting nationwide as families really look for innovative ways to educate children, it's a totally different model. So if we think about, I went to K-12 public schooling, most of us did. We know what school is like. We know that there is this sort of top-down curriculum. There's a regimentation to the day. We sort of separate learning into specific silos. 45 minutes we'll do English, 45 minutes we'll do writing, 45 minutes we'll do science. And it's really segmented that way. And with an unschooling environment, it's quite different. It's focused on this idea that humans are naturally curious. We love to learn. If you look at young children, you can't stop them from learning. They are passionate learners and curious and asking all kinds of questions. And as my colleague Peter Gray, who is a Boston College psychology professor, he wrote the foreword to my Unschooled book, what he says is this curiosity doesn't turn itself off when a kid hits 5 or 6 years old and goes to school. We turn it off with our coercive system of schooling. And so the idea with unschooling is just not to turn off those drives, that curiosity, that energy for learning, and instead to nurture that and facilitate that through these self-directed spaces.
So I get excited when I hear you talk about the power of curiosity. I often tell people, forget this whole business of trying to analyze your way into knowing what your passion is, and just explore your curiosities and allow that to provide you with self-knowledge. But something I come across a lot when I talk about this is people say things like, yeah, but if I allowed my child to just play, because Peter Gray talks about this in Free to Learn, right? Like play as the foundation for learning. If I allow my child to just play, then they're gonna sit around and play the same video game for 10 hours a day. Or they're just gonna play with action figures all day long, and they're gonna get stuck, and they won't learn all the things they need to know to be an adult. Is this something you've come across before? And what's your take on that?
Well, passion often leads to intense focus on something. So it's not unusual that if you're passionate about something, you may spend quite a bit of your time and energy on that thing. But typically, if we think about in our own lives what we're passionate about, that leads to tremendous learning. And I think the parents who may be worried that kids will just sit around and play video games all day if they're able to direct their own education or follow their interests, are looking at kids in school. Right? So there is a process that a lot of young people have to go through called deschooling when they leave that kind of conventional classroom environment. And they do need to reconnect with those natural human drives for curiosity and discovery and exploration. And there could be a time frame where, the kid has to figure out how to be in charge again of their own learning. But it's typically not that long if we give young people this freedom. And of course, for kids who've never been to school at all, they're retaining that natural creativity and curiosity right from the beginning.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned this deschooling because a lot of times we're looking at the person who's using curiosity as an escape from being made to do things they don't want to do for 8, 9 to 10 hours.
Exactly.
And when you approach maybe like playing a video game with a sense of scarcity, like I will never get to do this again,
right.
Because tomorrow I got to go to school, you tend to go all in on it. But when you have a sense of abundance, like, hey, I'm going to get the chance to come back and do this tomorrow, you tend to approach it a bit differently. Is that consistent with what you observe?
I think that's right. And I think video games are this interesting topic because video games for kids who are increasingly scheduled, who experience much more standardized curriculum in their everyday school day, that have all these extracurricular activities, a video game is often their only moment to be in charge, right, of their surroundings. And of course, to decompress from a very busy day of having, every minute organized and structured by someone else. So of course, you would retreat into this one mode of autonomy and self-expression and being in charge.
So what got you into this? Why is education your passion?
Yeah, so my undergraduate degree is in economics, and I became interested in the sort of idea of monopoly schooling, the fact that there are limited choices in education for many families from an economics perspective. But as I got into education more broadly and realized how much more was out there, that was what really triggered my interest. And in fact, I was able to, as an undergraduate, shadow a homeschooling family. And I never knew a homeschooler. This was in the late 1990s. Homeschooling had just become legally recognized in all 50 states just a few years prior, by 1993. So it was still relatively new. And I was able to shadow this homeschooling family. And my entire view of education shifted because, as I said, I went to K-12 public schooling and just assumed that this was how education is done. Yeah. And once I saw the possibilities for other ways of being educated, and this particular environment was very free, and the child had a lot of autonomy and opportunities for creativity and immersion in her community and all sorts of things, I was enchanted. And that was what ultimately triggered my overall interest in education innovation, alternatives to school, and different ways of learning.
Now, what was your next step after you realized this is the space I think I want to work in?
Yeah, so then I went to graduate school in education policy at Harvard. And at the time, this was, again, the kind of the turn of the millennium. At the time, if you were interested in education innovation, really the only place for you was the charter school movement, which had just really come on the scene. I mean, the first charter school was in Minnesota in 1991. So it was still kind of moving on to the mainstream that it is today. Now something like 6 or 7% of the overall K-12 population are in charter schools. So it's grown significantly in just a couple of decades. So that was where I spent a little bit of my time thinking about the kind of entrepreneurial educators who were looking to create charter schools with their vision for a different way of learning.
This is one of those issues where it seems like everyone agrees that we need more innovation. I mean, I feel like the easiest way to get an applause is to say, we need more creativity in schools, right? Or we need more innovation in education. There's not a person in the world that would disagree with that. And yet this is one area where it seems so hard to actually introduce those innovations? Like, what is the problem in education? Why is there so much continued frustration and so little progress?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all see that there's an issue. We all see that this kind of test-driven, standardized curriculum in our mass schooling system isn't working for everyone. And I think there are just really two approaches. There's those who really believe that they can reform the system from within. And then there are others of us, and I'd put myself in this camp, who believe that we need to innovate from outside of that model, that the current compulsory schooling model that we have was initiated in the mid-19th century as a way of kind of bringing people into this kind of common, they're called common schools, this sort of sameness, and really confining a broad definition of education into the four walls of a public school classroom. And so I think those of us who kind of advocate for education innovation and educational freedom are saying, let's expand beyond those four walls of a conventional school classroom and imagine all these other possibilities for learning.
It's mind-blowing for many when you talk about how the current conception of education we have is relatively recent.
Right.
It's not very old at all. I love to hear you talk about what education looked like for the majority of human history.
Well, I mean, the majority of human history were families and groups of people living together, passing along knowledge from one generation to the next to ensure human survival. And that was how we learned the tools of our culture over generations. And so this idea of kind of enclosing young people in a school environment is relatively new. And then making that compulsory is very new. That was only in 1852 that began in Massachusetts. And I like to kind of trace the difference between compulsory schooling and compulsory education because it gets to this idea of unschooling and kind of separating the two, where soon after the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1620, in the 1640s, they established the colony's first compulsory education laws that indicated a state interest in an educated citizenry in this new world, and that required cities and towns of a certain size to establish a school that would be taxpayer funded. So it was the town that was compelled by the state to provide educational resources. But the parents didn't have to send their kids there, and as the population in the colonies grew, there was a wide assortment of public and private schools, these apprenticeship models. Homeschooling, of course, was the default. There were what are known as dame schools, which were sort of preschool programs in your neighbor's kitchen. So there was sort of this church schools and charity schools. There was sort of this vibrant landscape of education options. Again, not fairly distributed. Certainly, there were inequities, and women and people of color were not included in some of these schools. But by the time compulsory mass schooling begins in 1852, all of a sudden, compulsory education shifts to compulsory schooling. And now, for the first time, parents are required to send their children to school under legal threat of force, despite the fact that at the time we had almost universal schooling and we had literacy rates of over 90% in some areas, including Massachusetts, where the first compulsory schooling law was passed. So it was at that time that schooling and education became conflated. And I think the thought now is, let's think about separating them again.
And when we argue for that distinction, there's often a reaction that says, oh, no, education and school are the same thing, and it's kind of been that way. But what you're really making a case for is the dominant way of doing things, the way of doing things that has the most historical backing behind it and that has a proven track record of really helping people grow. You quoted John Taylor Gatto earlier, you referenced him, and one idea he talked about is age segregation.
Right.
And this idea of quarantining people based on their age, but the 12-year-olds are with the 12-year-olds, the 17-year-olds are with the 17-year-olds.
Right.
And that's a pretty novel concept for most of human history. The idea that you would have friends, mentors, and coworkers that were a variety of different ages, that was the norm. And that prepares you for the real world, right?
And the age segregation was a key element of compulsory schooling that began in the mid-19th century, that the model that we have is based on the Prussian model of education, which was very much a militaristic, standardized model to create sort of a common people in Prussia, which is now much of modern-day Germany, that large swath of area. And that model really appealed to these education reformers who were dealing back in the United States with a rapidly changing culture. So what was happening was you had a lot of Irish immigrants immigrating into the United States in the early 19th century, Irish Catholic immigrants who threatened the dominant social order of the time. In fact, in Boston, the population doubled between 1820 and 1840 with this new immigration. And that threatened a lot of the leaders and citizens of Massachusetts, and they sort of led the way in thinking, well, these common schools, this Prussian model, will Americanize these immigrants, and we will put them into these purportedly secular schools, which of course taught the King James Version of the Bible, the Protestant Bible, had Protestant teachers. They were really mirroring this larger kind of Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture to try to assimilate these Irish Catholic immigrants and other immigrant groups. And so I think it's also important, and as I trace in the Unschooled book, it's important to really acknowledge the history of compulsory schooling, and that it wasn't always this magnanimous view of kind of bringing people together with equal opportunity. It was really a way of making sure that the masses were conforming to the dominant culture at the time.
Let's talk about this equal opportunity thing, and I want to present a devil's advocate objection, because I know when people talk about school choice, alternative education, something that often comes up is, hey, look, if you go that route, then school becomes this thing where, it's profit driven and it becomes really expensive, and the rich kids get high quality education, the poor kids end up not being able to afford that or what have you. And so this is just a bad move because it's just going to lead to greater exclusivity, greater marginalization, and you're taking money away from an approach to education that at least serves those communities. What's your response to that?
Well, I think whenever we're thinking about giving freedom and moving away from a system of social control into a system of innovation and experimentation, there's always fear of what if, right? But I think what we see in the education experimentation that's happening is it's in many cases parent-driven, that parents are really seeking alternatives. It's groups that really want new ways of learning. It's educational entrepreneurs who have a vision for what education could be. And I think if we allow for this kind of marketplace of education ideas, the way we do in so many other parts of our life, cereal boxes or soft drinks or whatever it might be, we have this kind of panoply of options. And yet with education, we have very little. And so and the other piece of that is that I think that if we think about innovation more globally, I often like to use the example of cell phones. So the first kind of commercially produced cell phone was created by Motorola. And I often think, if they were to create this cell phone and say, well, not everybody in the beginning is going to have access to this cell phone, we shouldn't create it. What a tragedy that would be for our modern world, when today we have 5 billion people who have cell phones. 5 billion people, not just cell phones, 5 billion people have cell phones. And so this idea that we have to innovate and then we're able to scale what works and make it accessible and available to everybody.
And so you're making the case that if we open that door for innovation, based on what we've seen in other areas, we can see more options for people, not less.
Exactly, more options, and more importantly, options that are right for each kid, right? Because I think we can all agree that so much of today's mass schooling is one size fits all. Again, that's what it was designed to be. It was a common school. And I think we see this need to differentiate and to make sure that we're individualizing learning based on each learner's needs, interests, passions, and goals.
I've always wondered what would education look like if we approached it in the way that we do physical fitness. Some people are interested in yoga. Some people don't want to be Olympic athletes. Some people are really interested in deadlifting, and they don't want to work out unless they feel like they're gonna die every time. There's some people that are more interested in aerobics, and everyone has different motives for working out. There's no one universal motive. Everyone doesn't have this noble reason. And there's a market that satisfies all those different styles, all those different motivations and interests, and everybody wins. I can only imagine what options would exist in education if the people that said, I want to focus on the arts, or I want to focus on entrepreneurship. Hey, I actually do care about making money and I want to develop skills that are useful towards that. Or, hey, that's less interesting to me. I'm interested in history and physics and so forth. Something that serves everyone. And I think a big problem that characterizes education today is there's so many debates over what's the one philosophy of education to rule them all.
Right. And I think another piece that's related to that is the power of technology to transform education today, where it used to be that you went to school because that was where the teachers were, that was where the books were, that was where the knowledge was. And now, of course, all of that is at our fingertips, often on our cell phone. And so there's so much more accessibility to knowledge and information. And to all of these resources and opportunities. So you can be exposed to different ideas, figure out what your passion is in so many different ways now. You don't have to sit in a classroom with a set standardized curriculum to figure out what your passion is. In fact, you probably have a better shot of doing that when you're fully immersed authentically in the world and connecting with people, places, and things around you.
Now, when you talk about this, you sound so convincing to me. What is the biggest objection you come up against, whether that's pragmatic or philosophical, for actually implementing these ideas?
Well, if we're talking about unschooling and self-directed education specifically, I think I wouldn't say it's an objection so much as a skepticism, because we think, well, kids can't learn this way, right? Which is really a reflection of humans can't learn this way. But yet I think this is how we learn. It's certainly how we learned when we were young children, before we were schooled. And I think it's what we then reconnect with in adulthood when we may start to discover our passions. And again, technology, I think, is able to help with that now. We're able to become self-directed learners. We're able to learn new skills and talents through accessing technology and those resources. And so I think the thing is to think about, how are we learning as adults, using technology, using the resources around us, discovering our passions, maybe reconnecting with a love of reading or some other skill or talent or interest that we might have had when we were young that sort of got ignored or crushed or we were sidetracked from. And that is what we want to give to our children, and realize that they learn exactly the same way and can have so much more success with figuring out what they want to be, what they want to do much, much earlier if they're given that opportunity.
Yeah, this whole business of trying to figure out how to motivate children to learn, it's kind of ironic, right? It's a problem that's created by sort of interrupting their natural process of exploration.
That's right. Yeah. And I think also applying our value judgments to that. So we might say, well, again, back to your earlier point about, well, what if kids are doing something intensely that they're really passionate about, but we think, oh, well, they're not getting this other skill, or they don't know key dates in history or something like that. And so we get sidetracked, I think, with our own schooled vision of education, because again, most of us went through this. This is what we imagine education to be. And we miss the fact that this child or this adolescent is learning so much by becoming really immersed in whatever passion project they're working on.
I can hear the voices in my head now. But aren't there things people have to know for the real world? I understand the passion with those Barbie dolls and all that stuff, but you have to be able to read. You have to be able to, do all these other things. What about that? I mean, is there a point where you should start getting nervous if your child isn't showing aptitude in math or science?
Well, I have two responses. One is that I always say that I think parents are the ones who are ultimately responsible for making sure their children are highly literate and numerate. And that holds true whether their children are in school or not in school. That I still think it's the parents' responsibility to see to their children's well-being, including their educational well-being. But the second piece of that is that through passions, it's amazing what we're able to learn. I mean, if you think about it, so many kids may not like reading, particularly now when expectations around reading readiness are being pushed younger and younger ages. So you now have a case where you have kindergartners being expected to read, and it's a real shift in sort of these societal expectations. And so if a child isn't ready to read at 5 and is being forced to read, or if a child may be ready to read but is being forced to read things that are not interesting to that child, they may develop an aversion to reading. Whereas if you let children kind of develop, surround them with literacy, surround them with resources and opportunities, they will become readers and will become passionate readers, and then will read about things that they're really interested in and read more than we would ever expect a child who's not so engaged with reading to do.
That makes me think about my own childhood, where me and my brother, we would buy the video game magazines that had like the cheat codes and stuff like that, and you couldn't keep us away from those magazines. We'd flip through and we'd read profusely, just trying to figure out how to conquer the game. And I think what you're saying is beautifully illustrated in a problem that most parents identify with, and that is you buy your child a toy. You're never going to have it so easy that kid will say, "Thanks, Mom and Dad, for this toy. I'll be happy forever." What's going to happen? They're going to spend all their time on it, and then they're going to get bored, right? And they're going to say, "I want a new toy." And that tells us something. That tells us that our brain craves novelty. There comes a point where even if you let us do whatever we want, we get bored really quickly, and we cannot have any further pleasure unless new elements of complexity are introduced. And that's what's being craved. And so all of these important things that need to be learned, they often come through that craving of complexity. People just can't stay at the same level of play and then continue to have fun.
I think that's right, and I think another really important piece is that the opportunity for learning needs to be available. So there needs to be adult facilitators, parents, other mentors available to these young people to connect them to various resources. Oh, you're really interested in this particular topic. Let me help to connect you to some digital resources, to some neighborhood resources, to a book that you might be interested in. So the adults in unschooling and in general education innovation play such an important role in facilitating learning, and that this isn't just a go-it-alone endeavor for young people. It's definitely being supported by the adults in the room.
All right, so I hear a lot of people say that I like these ideas, but I don't have the time. I'm in a 2-parent home, both parents are working, or I don't have the money to be able to afford private school.
Yes.
And so, I don't really like the public schooling system, but I do it out of necessity. What would you say to that?
I would say there is hope. There are these alternatives that are beginning to emerge that enable single parents, 2 working parents, other families who may otherwise not consider alternatives to the kind of 5-day-a-week conventional school model to hop on to these alternatives. One really innovative model is called the Da Vinci Charter School Network in California, which is a public charter school network where young people are attending a project-based school 2 days a week and then are homeschooling the rest of the time or engaged in other kind of community support. So if a family had to work full-time, there'd be other ways that those children could be supported. And that is a free to the consumer program because it's a public charter school, even though you're a homeschooler, and makes this option much more available to more families. There's a long waiting list in this charter school in particular, and there's other private models that work on that same framework where a child could go to a learning center, for example, 1 day a week, up to 5 days a week if a family wanted a 5-day-a-week option. But the idea in many of these, particularly these unschooling learning centers, is this focus on kind of non-coercive learning and the idea that really the learner is in charge of their education while being supported by the adults.
Yeah. Way more options than just you being there all the time, being the one that developed the curriculum and so forth. I don't want my children to be weird or to have low social intelligence. I hear that one all the time.
I think that's less true now. I mean, I think it used to be the stereotype of homeschooling. I'm not sure if it was ever really true, but it was certainly the caricature of homeschooling. And I think, but now where we have so many homeschoolers And homeschooling, again, is really a springboard for a lot of other education innovation because it puts parents back in charge of children's education. It helps to get around compulsory schooling statutes to enable more flexible scheduling in education. That I think there's less of that. Yeah. That, when we think about socialization, for example, is it really these age-segregated classrooms with a handful of teachers? Or is socialization learning the tools and customs of your culture by being immersed in that culture? And if it's the latter, then we really need to think about education beyond the four walls of a classroom.
Yeah, a lot of the homeschooling students I work with, they exhibit the opposite. They seem to be weird in all the right ways. They think for themselves, they're willing to deviate from the crowd, and these are all critical elements of success. You tell a lot of stories in your book, and one that you mentioned to me was the mother who went traveling with her son, I believe.
Yes.
And tell me a little bit about that.
Right. So this is Lainey and her son Miro, who right after the financial crisis in 2008, she was an entrepreneur. A lot of her client work dried up. And she said to her son, she was a single mother, said to her son who was enrolled in school at the time, let's just take some time off and travel the world and then figure out what we're going to do next, fully expecting that they would come back to the U.S., settle back down. She would either create a new business or find a new job. But this was just going to be a hiatus to reconnect with what they wanted to do next. And they loved it so much after 6 months that they said, let's just keep doing this. And so she started becoming an entrepreneur on the road, working with clients virtually, as we're so able to do nowadays. And her son was learning Spanish by living in South America and was learning the history of these places that they were visiting. And they ended up traveling the world for the next decade and developing an organization called Project World School that now invites other teens and young people to create these kind of immersive, intentional communities for 3 to 4 week periods of time in different places throughout the world.
Wow.
As this kind of alternative to school.
Talk about being willing to take a chance on the things you discover, right?
Yeah.
And that for her wasn't a process of saying, hey, I've spent 10 years meditating, I've discovered what my passion is, and I'm gonna move forward with all this certainty and support in the world. And say, I have a hunch, I have something that I'm interested in.
That's right.
I'm gonna take a chance on that, let's explore.
That's right. And now her son, who's all grown up, and really reflects in articles and stories he's written about this incredible experience that he had traveling the world and learning about all these cultures from being there. He's now running the organization and bringing in these teens and young people from around the world to learn by being immersive learners in the world. Yeah.
All right, something that comes up a lot in talks on education is, what is the goal of education? What's your philosophy here? What should education aim to achieve?
I think education should aim to pass on knowledge, information, skills, and tools to the rising generation and empower individuals to reach their full potential.
Yeah, I love it. Kerry, is there any story from your book that is your personal favorite, or one that you hear a lot of people tell you, oh, this is one that really impacted me?
Well, I would say the most surprising part of writing the book was realizing all of the teachers, the conventional public school teachers who were working in classrooms, who had this inkling that something wasn't right. Yeah. They were frustrated by the sort of standard teach and test format. Were looking for another way. Yeah. And then happened upon this idea of unschooling or alternatives to school, and then launched self-directed learning centers or other kinds of innovative schools. And as I was going back through my notes and my research, it almost seemed contrived, as though I had just handpicked these teachers. But it really, this is who's running these interesting centers and these interesting schools. For the most part, they are former teachers, former educators, who became really disillusioned by what they were seeing in the classroom and wanted to build something new.
That's very interesting. You would say a majority of the people that you've maybe interviewed or talked to?
I would say well over a majority, probably 90% of them, in the book.
I would imagine that people that work in the system would lean towards the reform approach that you described.
It's possible. I mean, of course, my book was focused on alternatives. So when I went to these spaces, these were people who had already decided to create something new. But I often wonder, because for a lot of those educators, there was such randomness associated with how they discovered another possibility. So I think a lot of educators feel frustrated at what they're seeing in schools, but don't know that there's another way. And my favorite story is one educator who now runs a self-directed learning center, but at the time was a conventional school teacher, feeling frustrated, and he was driving along a highway in Western Massachusetts and happened to see a sign for North Star self-directed learning for teens, and he swerves off the highway, not knowing anything about this place, but it turns out that North Star was one of the first self-directed learning centers in the country. It started in 1996 by a former middle school history teacher in public schools, and that was the trigger for this other educator to create his own version of that. So there's so much randomness associated with these educators who then go on and launch alternatives to school. But I think for every one of those educators who's launching a new enterprise, there are so many other educators who are feeling those same feelings, but don't know what they could do next.
So let's talk about that. When you look out maybe 10 years from now, what do you see happening in the future of education? Are you optimistic about the possibilities, or you feel like this is an uphill battle and we're going to kind of be basically where we are now?
I am optimistic. I really feel like we are moving from force to freedom in education. I think it's being driven by both parent dissatisfaction with a one-size-fits-all education model and educator frustration with the same system that stifles teacher creativity in the same way it stifles learner creativity. I mean, if you ask most teachers why they went into teaching, it was to work with young people, help them reach their full potential, share information and knowledge, be enthusiastic about learning. And then they get into this environment and it's nothing like that. It's much more standardized, focused on classroom management and all of those frustrations. So I think a model that not only taps into learner potential and passion, but also teacher potential and passion is the way forward.
All right, I got to ask you about our theme for the month. So one of the themes we're focusing on with Revolution of One is anger. A lot of people feel outraged and angry at a lot of things going on in the world. And it's very easy to look out at society and say, I don't like that. That upsets me. That grieves me. What are some insights you can offer on how people can deal constructively with the things that anger them about society?
Right. Well, I would say that in the education space, there's a lot to be angry about. There's a lot of limits on choice. There's a lot of families who have no other option but to send their child to an assigned district school based on their zip code. And that makes people quite angry, as it should. And so I think that the key is to use that anger in a way that creates something new and different. So to advocate for more choice for families, to build something new and different, to imagine an entirely new way of being educated.
Yeah, I like that. Let's talk for a minute about higher education. Do you do much work and research when it comes to post-secondary work, college alternatives and so forth?
There are some college alternatives. I mean, there's certainly gap years are becoming increasingly popular. There's apprenticeship programs like the Praxis model that enables young people to be connected with skills and training and get jobs by bypassing higher ed. I focus mostly on K-12 only because that's where the compulsion piece is. I mean, I think once you're an adult, you kind of move beyond this expectation of compulsion and compulsory learning, and you do, even if you don't feel like you have a lot of options, you, as an adult, have more options than, say, a child or an adolescent does. But I think that as education becomes more innovative overall, that will expand to both elementary, secondary, and higher education levels.
All right, I've got one more question about choice I have to ask you. Let's say you're dealing with someone who, 12 years old, they can't call their own shots in life. And they're very interested in alternative education. I've seen a few instances of this. And they may beg mom and dad to be homeschooled or to have a more self-directed path. And they're just sort of looked at as, you just kind of want the lazy way out. You just don't want to do your homework. and they're experiencing themselves as not having a lot of power to influence their situation. And this is one of those cases where if you can't sell mom and dad, you've just got to go to school. What advice could you offer someone in that state to feel a greater sense of freedom and power in relation to their learning when they clearly can't dictate their own schooling path?
Right. It's interesting you bring that up because one of the more popular books around alternatives and unschooling is a book by Grace Llewellyn called The Teenage Liberation Handbook. And in it, she lays out a lot of these different paths for education and really focuses on adolescents and teenagers who are feeling frustrated by schooling. And she gives strategies for how to communicate with your parents, your desire to do something different and to move towards something instead of away from something. And I think that's a key message for young people if they're trying to convince their parents or other adults that this isn't just leaving school, this is moving toward something new and better that has so much more potential. So that's one piece of it. And then I think the other piece is just feeling empowered, that even if you have to stay in school or you have to be in this kind of conventional education environment, that you have the power to learn what you're passionate about, that you can go off and learn a new skill, create a new business, start an online marketplace. There are so many possibilities for you.
So we've talked about people who might be interested in alternative education for their child or children who want to be homeschooled. But what about the people who maybe their children have grown up or they don't have any kids, but they want to support more choice when it comes to schooling? How can they support?
Right, that's a really great question because you have the young people who can take charge of their own education, you have the parents who can search for alternatives, you have the entrepreneurial educators and parents who can build alternatives. But what about everybody else?
Right.
And I think that's where supporting, educators and parents in creating new models of education is really helpful. From a practical perspective, it's advocating for education choice mechanisms like education savings accounts or tax credit scholarship programs that enable access for a lot of families into these alternatives to school that they may not otherwise have access to.
All right, so outside the realm of entrepreneurship and education philosophy, what do you most enjoy learning about personally? That's kind of unfairly framed, right? You talked about passion and so forth, and I basically said outside of what you're passionate about, what you're passionate about.
It's so funny. I feel like most of my time is spent reading about education history and with education, there's so many different avenues. There's so many different, you can read philosophy, you can read economics. I think right now, as I said, I was an economics major, but didn't learn a lot of Austrian economics as an undergraduate. And so, now reading more about the Austrian school of thought is definitely a passion for mine.
Yeah. Kerry, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about education. I think our viewers have gained a lot from this in terms of what they can do to take those next steps to making this space freer. Appreciate your time.
It was great to be here, TK.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for watching this week's episode with Kerry McDonald. Be sure to check out her book, Unschooled: How to Raise Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Classroom. You can also follow her on Instagram at instagram.com/wholefamilylearning, and you can check her out at fee.org/Kerry. Also, be sure to check us out at fee.org/Rev1 for articles, weekly Motivational Monday videos, and for our monthly YouTube videos. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at instagram.com/feeonline and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And lastly, subscribe to us on iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify, and be sure to leave a review. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.